All right, guys, here we are back again with our discussion on contemporary Christian philosophers. And I'm actually excited today because, well, how do I word this? We've talked about some of these Thomistic philosophers like Phaser, and we may mention, Geisler, at some point, something like that. But this guy, this dude that we're about to talk about today is honestly probably one of my favorite philosophers. Not necessarily because I happen to go in regard to the same school of thought as this philosopher, but he's one of the funniest people on Facebook and even possibly just in general, just a hilarious guy, super quick wit, which is appropriate for a philosopher. And this is Mark Linville, PhD. Now, you may be thinking, well, how is this guy a significant thinker, right, in regards to theistic philosophy when it's very possible that you haven't heard of Mark Linville? Well, as we said, when we mentioned at the onset of this particular course, the first couple lectures, that some of these guys, some of these philosophers that we talk about may be uh, super impactful because they're on the forefront, or it may be because they are impactful, but they're in the background somewhere. Now, this is true in regards to Linville. He's a very influential philosopher, Christian thinker, but it's going to be more so in the background. So let's go ahead and get into some of this, and I'll tell you what I mean by in the background in just one moment. Now, if you're looking at your slide here, his nationality, he's from the United States, another Anglo-American thinker here in regards to philosophy of religion. Originally from, well, I should say it this way, spent most of his childhood, grew up in Florida, was something of a late bloomer as it pertains to his faith, and then his intellectual journey. He goes back to school a little bit later in life, not necessarily, not like 30, late 20s or anything like that, but just a little bit later than the traditional student would go. He originally had dropped out of high school, and then later completed his GED. Was married very early, and then decided to return to school um, uh, because of initially an interest in apologetics and whatnot, which seems to be a lot of the influence or a lot of the motivation for so many thinkers, right? That are theists to return to school and pursue academic pursuits. Now he ends up finishing up, going back to college, doing his graduate work, and then finishing up his PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Now, having said that, let's go ahead and look at some of these notable and/or significant ideas and/or arguments. And this is where Linville is going to really uh, come into his own, especially in being so impactful, yet not necessarily the average apologist or philosopher of religion may not necessarily know who he is unless they're professionals in some sense. Now, his significant impact here, his significant idea and or argument is that Linville, if you're familiar at all with William Lane Craig's moral argument for the existence of God, one of William Lane Craig's favorite arguments that he loves to give um, in regard to the existence of God at college campuses and all sorts wherever presentations, debates, and whatnot. Mark Linville, this philosopher here, was actually a student of William Lane Craig when he was at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. And Linville's argument is actually the argument that is given in the Blackwell Companion to Natural Theology. So if you've taken a natural theology course here or a philosophy of religion course here, then it may very well be the case that you've had to use the Blackwell's Natural Companion to Natural Theology, which was edited and whatnot by William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland. And Linville is actually the one that is responsible for composing and giving the argument in that particular text. In fact, he's just looking at a couple of these books back here that go over different arguments for and against the existence of God, whether they be apologetics books or just even philosophy of religion type books. And Linville's argument makes an appearance in more than a few of these. And that is simply, let's just go ahead and use the syllogism that someone like Craig would use, um, would be a modus tollens argument, a syllogism that would state something like this, if I'm correct, if I'm recalling this correctly, that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist, but objective moral values and duties do exist. Therefore, God exists. So it's a modus tollens. You're denying the consequent there. So the antecedent is what would follow from that type of argument. But anyway, this is Linville's. He's the one that has really made this argument popular, and this is one of his main contributions. Now, he's done other work, right? He's written some things in regards to Molinism, possible world type semantics. He has contributed. In various different ways in regards to philosophy of religion epistemology, some of these other areas. But this big contribution from Linville, again, especially if you're following and if you're a fan of those types of moral arguments that Craig would give, this is your go-to guy, right? Now, I hate to say, and it's sad to say, that I really tried to work out. I don't know if you're able to access this, so you may have to wait a little later in the course for some of the cool interviews that I actually get to give with some of these philosophers of religion, some of these philosophers, just to kind of break up the monotony of the normal lecture style here. Linville, I'm very privileged to call him a friend. In some sense. And so I was really hoping to be able to work it out where we could get to interview Linville, just so you could get to see some of his just excellent humor, and then some of his insight on some of the questions that I actually ask of the philosophers when I interview them, when I talk with them, as you'll get to see a little bit later in the course. But we just couldn't make it work out. We couldn't get it to the schedules to click and whatnot. And I really hate that, just for the sake of you guys. Really wanted to be able to get that to work out. However, again, suffice to say for the moment that his significant idea, his significant argument is this very famous, very easy to employ moral argument. Now, part of his significant idea and his argument here is being able to interact with objections to that first premise of the argument, which would namely be, if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. So some of your typical objections to that, of course, would be, well, that's just a false dichotomy. Of course, this is what the opponent may say, of course, there's no God, but we still have objective moral values and duties. You don't need God for that. And so they will offer up all kinds of competing theories, competing ethical theories, say even most likely something like some other deontological system, which Linville is a proponent of. He really is a fan of Kant's deontology there, combined with obviously the existence of God to complete that, to ground that out. But he's very good. Martin Linville has been very successful in dealing with counter points to that first premise. I'm probably going to wait and say something in regard to that, and down here later in the slide on the notes where it says notable debates and/or presentations. But anyway, his ideas have been the moral argument. Significant ideas being the moral argument, and then his ability to interact with objections to that first premise, to shoot down any sort of alternative explanation that would truly ground. That would give a true ontological grounding for the existence of moral values and duties outside of the existence of God. Now, I've already mentioned what may be his most significant work. I mean, it may not be the most significant work in the sense of academic power or that which has caused the biggest splash in the academic community, but it's definitely going to be his most significant work. That piece written for the Blackwell's Companion in Natural Theology is definitely going to be one of the more significant works, simply in the sense that it was so impactful, right, for philosophers of religion, apologists of all stripes, and it reached such a wide audience because of it being featured in that Blackwell's Companion to Natural Theology. In fact, I don't know any theistic philosopher that doesn't employ, when he's talking about um, arguments for and against the existence of God, I don't know any theistic philosopher that doesn't make reference to an argument like Linville's. Now, even if they do hold to some other account, some other ethical theory, at least for the grounding aspect, it's just I don't see really any that don't reference Linville's argument in some sense. Um, he's also contributed again because of his quick wit, his ability to really relate to the average person of normal or developed intelligence. He can just really relate to just again non-professionals yet that are thinking people. He's really strong in that regard, being able to relate to those types of people, and so therefore he's not only contributed his work in regards to moral philosophy um, in the academic realm, like the Companion to Natural Theology, but also, again, I'm just looking at a couple different pamphlets and or books, apologetics types of materials where he's the author of those pieces. So you have something like Contending with Christianity's Critics. He's featured there. Even these little Ravi Zacharias pamphlets, who's a notable thinker in his own right. Linville writes so many of these just for these little types of parachurch ministries, um, uh, pieces in regards to morality and how that relates to the existence of God. So again, just even like this little pamphlet, "Can We Be Good Without God?" from Ravi Zacharias. Um, Linville is the composer of this too. So he's just making these big impacts. He's really a culturally significant theistic philosopher, though you may not know his name per se, because he's just showing up all over the place. And even the quote unquote famous or big name philosophers are really employing a lot of his work, and he's the driving force behind a lot of that. Now, I said I was going to make a couple quick remarks in regard to significant debates or presentations. Now, there is a famous moral philosopher, or at least he has a lot of he deals in moral philosophy a lot, even if he's not technically speaking a moral philosopher, and that would be the atheistic philosopher Michael Ruse, and which is and he's a very likable individual as well. Now, Mark Linville went back and forth with a couple of different academic papers with Michael Ruse. And if we're able to get our hands on those, that would be really cool. I'm sure that, in this day and age on the internet, the interwebs, right? The internet, it wouldn't be that difficult to Google and locate if you have the extra time to do that. Again, probably don't. We've got enough work in our course alone, and then your other classes, you're probably swamped. Yet, he's got a back and forth with Michael Ruse that's not only, I feel like, very persuasive in its defense of objective moral values and duties existing, but then also having to exist in regards to the existence of God, or because of the existence of God. Because Michael Ruse tries to offer this I want to say odd to be charitable, but this odd belief that objective moral values and duties exist, yet he knows that they're not really objective and or absolute in any shape, form, or fashion, though he believes in them. Right. So Linville and Linville really has this again a very humorous way of pointing out just the absurdity of what Ruse seems to be trying to say there, without being um, mean spirited, without being just overly uh, heavily sarcastic. Right. He has just a very quick wit about him in a way that just really exposes the absurdity of notions like that are very humorous, very to the point, very easy to understand, will cause a laugh even, but at the same time, he has the ability to keep that from being just overly sarcastic to the point of diminishing or belittling his opponent there. It really would be a good thing if Linville would do a more public style of debate, though he says himself, though, that that's just not his strength. He claims that if he were to try to do public style debates as opposed to just the academic type presentations through submitted paper, submitted essays and papers, he claims that he freezes up, which may be the case. I just I don't know. I guess I can't really say whether he would or wouldn't. I wish he'd kind of try it out, a little more often. Though he is getting older, right? He's not by any stretch of the word a young man anymore. He's an older individual. Nevertheless, very entertaining, very humorous, very very fun philosopher to read and to follow. Again, makes sense out of very difficult concepts that anyone can understand if they're trying to think. Right. Now, having said that, in regard to Michael Ruse, William Lane Craig recently, at least in regard to this recording, has had a relatively recent debate with a philosopher named Eric Wielenberg, right? I hope I'm pronouncing that name, maybe Wielenberg, I believe. But anyway, Craig has debated him recently over the existence of God, specifically this moral argument. And Eric Wielenberg, the atheistic philosopher, has argued for objective moral values and duties using some sort of lack of better word, something like a moral Platonism type of view, that these moral values and duties just exist objectively and truly, yet there's no God, claims Willenberg, that is needed to ground these objective moral values and duties. And Mark Linville has been in, again, not public debate, but in debate via academic realm, right, with papers and essays and whatnot. Again, this goes back to Linville's strength in addressing the objections to that first premise, right, that you can get objective moral values and duties out of or outside of the existence of God. And so Linville interacts with this very worthy opponent in Wielenberg, who's trying to argue that objective moral values and duties exist without any appeal to the existence of God. Again, Linville really shines in being able to debate or present, right, in the academic realm against that notion, notably, again, in the worthy opponent of Wielenberg there. So again, even though we may not have time, right, we've got enough coursework already, if possible. Google that if you want to look into that a little more in depth there. Now, there could be a couple different areas in which we say that he has some significant debate and/or presentations, and I may go back to that depending on the time frame here. Now, as we've always kind of summed up these lectures, these again very quick, just overview who we're looking at, some of these individuals that we're looking at here, we've kind of just summed up with their school of thought, right? Now, it's going to be, again, a no surprise, right, that Linville is going to fall into, again, the modern analytic version of a philosopher. He's coming from that school of thought. In fact, when I said earlier that, at least in some sense, this type of philosopher doesn't want to claim a school of thought as much as they just want to say that we just take individual arguments and judge them based on their own merits, regardless of wherever your school of thought may be, right? I don't really care if you're a continental philosopher. I don't really care if you're a Thomistic, Aristotelian Thomistic philosopher. I don't really care if you're a this, that, or the other, Reformed epistemology, whatever you may identify with. Just bring your argument. Let's evaluate on its own terms. In fact, when I said that earlier, Linville was the one who had said that to me in some regard. And I can't remember the context of how he told me that. I don't remember if I'd asked him what school of thought he was from. This is probably 10 years or so ago. But I just specifically remember him saying that's not so much the issue. The issue really is, what is your argument, and can it stand? Now, of course, though, I love Linville, for all of these reasons I've mentioned, but at the same time, I've come to kind of just question that point of view, even though I'm very, very leery in crossing swords with someone like Linville and his intellectual capacity there. However, he would not object to being put into, again, just what being trained, academically trained as a modern analytic in modern analytic philosophy. Again, this is in contrast to continental philosophy, and in some sense, not though totally unrelated, but not the same thing either, in contrast to the Aristotelian Thomistic school of thought and philosophy. So already we see that school of thought, this modern analytic school of thought, this academic training, is going to be predominant, right? And even all of these thinkers that we've discussed thus far, not all, but already the majority of them are trained in the modern analytic sense of philosophy. Now, we will look at a few later. Fraser was one of them that were trained in that school, but shifted over to a different school of thought. In this instance, Aristotelian Thomistic type of thought. Just as a side note, there are others too that were trained in modern analytic philosophy but swapped over to a different school of thought. Like Richard Rorty famously comes to mind, or infamously comes to mind. And he goes over to a more postmodern type pragmatic view of philosophy. Anyway, we don't have time for that. But I'm just simply saying that some, even though they may be trained in some particular school of thought, have migrated over to different schools of thought. Not really much more to add here in regard to Linville. Simply that he is one of these philosophers that is having massive impact in the realm of philosophy of religion, though it's behind the scenes. So again, he is one of the philosophers that are having massive impact, but though he's not up front, right? Though he's not front and center, he doesn't get the notoriety, he doesn't get the prestige that a lot of apologetics junkies, right, are looking for, or that are noticing. Yet he is making a huge impact within the philosophy of religion, and not just in philosophy of religion, but just in philosophy as a whole. One of the things that we haven't discussed at all yet up until this point in the course, which I probably should have addressed at the onset, is just the monumental impact that these philosophers, among others, but obviously these that we're discussing, have had in what we would call just the renaissance of Christian philosophy. That it's a relatively new thing that Christians are having such a massive impact within the discipline of philosophy. Now, of course, historically speaking, they've always had a large impact, made very significant contributions. But in the relatively recent development of philosophy, right, since the early 1800s and whatnot, up until the modern era, Christians had kind of just bailed out in some real sense, which was very unfortunate. However, again, these guys have had just a massive impact in bringing about this renaissance, this coming of age again, or coming about again of Christian thinkers in the philosophical community. And Linville is definitely one of the guys that contributes to this. Like I said, one of the interesting side notes or interesting just trivia points was that he was actually a student of William Lane Craig. Though he's not necessarily much younger, this was in the very, very early days of Craig's teaching career. So they're even though they're roughly the same age, he was right up under them there, and he was actually taught by William Lane Craig. And Craig, I've even heard Craig mention him multiple times, whether it be on podcasts or interviews or even in debate, reference either Linville and or / his work, Linville's work. So having said that, this rounds up with just another quick lecture on contemporary philosophers of significance in regards to Christian thought. So hope you enjoy that one. Again, all of these are quick. Hopefully you're really digging into our texts here to get more of the depth, and we will see you next time as we discuss our next philosopher, next thinker.